Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive into the world of true crime. Today's story is not for the faint of heart. This is the terrifying tale of Pedro Alonso López, one of the most prolific serial killers in history, often referred to as the Monster of the Andes. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll unravel the horrors that earned him this dark title, the circumstances that allowed him to terrorize 3 nations, and the unbelievable twists that left him walking free. If you're ready for an unforgettable look into the mind of pure evil, stay tuned, because this story will shock you. Every monster has an origin story, and Pedro Alonso López is no different. Born in 1948 into a life of poverty in Santa Isabel, Colombia, López's early life was marred by tragedy and violence. His father, a member of the conservative Colombian army, was killed in combat just before Pedro was born. Raised by a mother who was both neglectful and abusive, López's childhood was a living nightmare. At the age of 8, he was thrown out of his home after being caught molesting his younger sister. Forced to live on the streets, Pedro's life became even more desperate. On the streets, López quickly fell prey to older predators. He was abducted by a man who promised him food and shelter but instead sexually assaulted him. This horrifying incident marked a turning point in López's life, and from that moment on, he began his descent into darkness. The abuse he suffered planted a seed of hatred and violence that would grow and manifest in the most horrific ways later in life. During his teenage years, López found refuge in a home for orphans, but even here, he was unable to escape the cycle of abuse. After attempting to steal a car, he was caught and sent to prison, where he experienced further brutality at the hands of other inmates. According to López himself, it was in prison that he committed his first murder, killing one of the inmates who had raped him. This act of revenge seemed to solidify his violent tendencies, and once released, Pedro Alonso López was a changed man, no longer a victim, but a predator. By the 1970s, López had begun his infamous killing spree, targeting young girls across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. His victims were typically between the ages of 9 and 12, innocent children from impoverished rural communities who were easily lured by his deceptive charm. López's method was as chilling as it was effective. He would offer his victims small gifts, or promises of money or toys, and once they trusted him, he would lead them to remote areas where he could carry out his horrific acts of violence. Once isolated, López would rape and strangle his victims before burying their bodies in shallow graves. The sheer number of victims is what makes López's story so incomprehensible. Over the course of his spree, he claimed to have killed over 300 young girls. What's even more terrifying is how he managed to carry on these crimes for so long without raising any suspicion. In these rural areas, poverty and crime were rampant, and the disappearances of young girls were tragically overlooked by local authorities. Pedro Alonso López would later describe his crimes in chilling detail, stating that he felt a sense of satisfaction each time he took a life. His cold, emotionless recounting of his crimes only added to his horrifying legacy. López was not driven by anger or revenge, but by a desire for power and control over the most vulnerable members of society, young, innocent girls who never stood a chance against him. In 1980, López's reign of terror came to an end, but only by sheer luck. He was caught attempting to abduct another young girl in Ecuador. A group of local women saw what was happening and managed to restrain him long enough for the police to arrive. When he was taken into custody, López initially denied everything, but it wasn't long before he began confessing to his gruesome crimes. In fact, he boasted about them. His confessions were delivered with an eerie calmness, and it was clear that he took pride in the number of lives he had destroyed. When López led investigators to the burial sites of his victims, they were met with a scene of pure horror. Mass graves, filled with the remains of young girls, were uncovered across multiple locations. The scale of his killing spree was staggering, and investigators were left with the daunting task of identifying each victim and notifying their families. The tragedy of Pedro Alonso López's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims. Entire communities were left grieving for the children who had been so cruelly taken from them. But perhaps the most shocking part of López's arrest was his demeanor. He showed no remorse, no regret, and no sign of guilt. Instead, he spoke about his victims as though they were objects, mere playthings in his twisted game. His lack of empathy and total detachment from the suffering he had caused is something that still haunts those who worked on the case. Despite confessing to the murders of over 100 girls in Ecuador alone, Pedro Alonso López was sentenced to just 16 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed under Ecuadorian law at the time. This light sentence sparked outrage among the families of his victims and the international community. How could a man who had admitted to killing hundreds of children be sentenced to less than 2 decades behind bars? But the legal system in Ecuador was unprepared to deal with someone like Pedro Alonso López. The country had never encountered a serial killer of his magnitude before, and the sentencing laws reflected this lack of foresight. For many, the idea that López would one day walk free was an unimaginable injustice, but it was a reality they would have to face. In 1994, after serving just 14 years of his sentence, Pedro Alonso López was released for good behavior. Yes, you heard that right. Good behavior. He was handed over to Colombian authorities, who briefly held him for further prosecution. However, due to the complexities of international law and a lack of solid evidence for further crimes in Colombia, López was released once again. And then, he vanished. To this day, Pedro Alonso López's whereabouts are unknown. Some reports suggest that he might have been killed by vigilantes or rival criminals. Others speculate that he assumed a new identity and has continued his life of crime in another part of the world. The mystery of his disappearance has only added to his dark legend, and the fact that such a dangerous man could simply vanish without a trace is a haunting reminder of how justice sometimes fails to bring true closure. Pedro Alonso López's story is one of tragedy, violence, and unanswered questions. Over 300 families were robbed of their daughters, and to this day, many of them never received proper justice. The monster of the Andes left a trail of devastation that will never be forgotten, and the horror of his crimes continues to resonate with true crime enthusiasts around the world. What can we learn from this case? How do we make sense of a man like Pedro Alonso López? His childhood trauma, the failures of the legal system, and the sheer scale of his violence all combine to make him one of the most terrifying figures in criminal history. But perhaps the most chilling part of this story is the idea that López might still be out there, living among us, unseen, unnoticed, and waiting. Thank you for joining us on this unsettling journey into the life and crimes of Pedro Alonso López, the monster of the Andes. If you found this deep dive as chilling as we did, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming content. We'll continue to explore the darkest corners of human behavior, bringing you the stories that shock, disturb, and leave you questioning the very nature of evil. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, sometimes, the monsters are not just a part of the past. They may still be out there, lurking in the shadows.